It wasn't my son-in-law's public insult that broke me. It was the sound of my own daughter's laugh that followed. Before I begin my story, let me know in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is. I just want to know, I'm not alone in this. And if you feel moved by what you hear, consider subscribing. It helps more people become aware of the reality of elder abuse. Now let me tell you what really happened. The worst night of my life didn't start with a tragedy. It started with applause. The sound echoed in the high-ceilinged dining room of the Northwood Country Club, a wave of polite, satisfied clapping for my son-in-law, Greg. I sat at the head table, a relic on display, feeling the vibrations through the starched white linen of the tablecloth. The room was a sea of expensive suits and glittering jewelry, a world Greg and my daughter Caroline had cultivated with a fervor I found both impressive and faintly nauseating. It was a world built on the foundations of the company my late husband Robert and I had started with calloused hands and a shared dream in a dusty rented garage 40 years ago. Now, Vance Reclamation sponsored galas. It felt like putting a tailored suit on a noble old workhorse. It might look refined, but it missed the entire point of the creature's strength. Greg was at the podium, basking in the spotlight, his teeth impossibly white against his fashionable tan. He was handsome, charismatic, and he knew it, wielding his charm like a finely honed tool. He spoke a language I barely understood, a slick corporate dialect of synergies, optimizing vertical integrations, and leveraging brand identity. He was painting a picture of the future, a future in which the solid, respected company Robert and I had built, piece by reclaimed piece, would become a global lifestyle brand. I glanced at the faces in the crowd, the rapt attention they gave him, and a small, quiet knot tightened in my stomach. To me, the beauty of our work had always been in the substance. The heft of a century-old heart pine beam, the intricate acanthus leaf carving on a forgotten fireplace mantel, the story whispered by a weathered piece of Vermont slate. To Greg it was all just content for an Instagram feed, interchangeable props for a carefully curated image. I could almost hear Robert's gentle rumbling laugh at the absurdity of it all, and the thought was a fresh pang of grief. The applause died down and Greg, beaming, opened the floor to questions. An older man stood up, a respected property developer named Jim Gable, who had been one of Robert's first major clients. Jim was old school, a man whose handshake was a contract. His own success was built on solid ground, not on abstract concepts. Greg, Jim started, his voice carrying the easy authority of old money, a fantastic presentation. I was curious. I heard you passed on the old textile mill acquisition on the river. Seemed like a solid opportunity, a treasure trove of heart pine and old brick. Robert would have been all over that. A flicker of annoyance crossed Greg's perfect face, a momentary crack in the polished facade. He shot a glance at me so fleeting that only I, attuned to his every subtle resentment, could have caught it. The decision to pass on the mill had been mine. I had spent 2 weeks in my study, poring over the structural reports, the environmental surveys, and the wildly inflated asking price. It was a poor investment, a sentimental trap disguised as an opportunity. Greg had wanted it for the prestige, for the splashy headline it would generate. Vance Reclamation revitalizes historic landmark. I had exercised my quiet veto, a power granted to me in the company's founding documents, a power he resented with every fiber of his ambitious being. He had been furious for weeks, a petulant, silent anger that chilled our family dinners. He recovered quickly, his charming smile snapping back into place. He leaned into the microphone, adopting a confidential man-to-man air. A great question, Jim. A really insightful question. And you're right, the old guard would have jumped on it. Robert, God rest his soul, had an amazing eye for those kinds of projects. He paused, letting the feigned reverence hang in the air. But in the new economy, a company has to be nimble. You have to be aggressive, ready to pivot. He let his eyes sweep the room, making contact with the bankers and investors, his real audience. Then they landed on me. It wasn't a look of warmth or inclusion, but a pinpoint of dismissive focus, cold and sharp. And it's hard to be nimble, he said, his voice dropping slightly, when every decision is scrutinized by what amounts to a walking expense holding the purse strings. A shocked silence fell, absolute and profound. It was as if the air had been sucked out of the room, leaving a vacuum that pulled at my ears and made my heart pound against my ribs. Wine glasses stopped halfway to mouths. The cheerful, mindless chatter ceased completely. Every eye, every single one, darted towards me. I felt the heat of their collective gaze, 100 pinpricks of curiosity, pity, and morbid fascination. I sat frozen, my back ramrod straight, the insult echoing in the cavernous silence. A walking expense. The term was so dehumanizing, so brutally corporate. He had reduced my 40 years of work, my partnership with my husband, my entire identity within the company, to a line item on a balance sheet that was holding him back. I was no longer Eleanor Vance, co-founder, the woman who had kept the books, negotiated with scrappy salvage crews, and personally cataloged every piece of inventory for 3 decades. I was a cost to be managed. An obstacle. Before the silence could curdle into a full-blown social catastrophe, I heard it. A sound that was infinitely more painful than Greg's public insult, more wounding than the stares of 100 strangers. It was the sound of my own daughter, Caroline, forcing a brittle, tinkling laugh. It wasn't a real laugh. It was a social tool, a desperate, shiny piece of tinsel thrown over a gaping hole to distract everyone from the ugliness. "What my brilliant husband means," she announced, her voice overly bright and cheerful, a terrible parody of wifely support, "is that we can't be sentimental anymore. It's time to be bold." She reached over and patted my hand, a gesture that was meant to look like affection but felt like a final, dismissive pat on the head of a doddering old pet. The humiliation was absolute, a perfectly executed assassination. Greg had fired the shot, but it was my own daughter who had handed him the knife, smiled, and then helped him twist it. In her eyes I saw not malice but something far worse, a complete and utter calculation. She had weighed her mother's dignity against her husband's ambition and found it wanting. I don't remember leaving the table. There was no scene, no outburst of tears, no defiant speech. I think I murmured something about needing some air, a polite fiction to cover my retreat. I remember the feeling of the plush carpet under my sensible heels as I walked away, a long, lonely journey across the vast dining room. I could feel the weight of their stares on my back, a physical pressure. No one spoke to me as I left. I was a ghost at the feast, the embarrassing old relative who had just been publicly put in her place. The wave of their relief at my departure was almost palpable. The drive home was a silent, cold journey through the glittering, indifferent city. The blur of streetlights streaked across the windshield like tears I couldn't shed. The radio was off. The only sound was the low hum of the engine of the modest sedan I still drove. My shock wasn't loud or explosive. It was a deep, silent cold that settled in my bones, a permafrost freezing my heart. The phrase "walking expense" echoed in my head, a 2-word summary of my life's work as seen through the eyes of the man I had entrusted it to. But it was Caroline's laugh that played on a relentless, cruel loop. The sound of her cheerful, utter betrayal. She hadn't defended me. She hadn't even stayed silent in horrified embarrassment. She had actively, brightly endorsed the insult. She had chosen him, his ambition, and his vision of the world over her own mother, in front of everyone who mattered in their world. I remembered her as a little girl, clinging to my leg in the dusty warehouse, her face smudged with dirt, promising she would work with me and Daddy forever. That little girl was gone, replaced by a stranger in a designer dress. By the time I walked into my empty house, the house Robert and I had filled with so much love and laughter, the grief had burned away, leaving something hard and clear in its place. The shock had crystallized into purpose. I walked past the living room with its comfortable, well-worn furniture, and went straight to Robert's old study, a room I kept exactly as he had left it. The scent of old books, pipe tobacco, and wood polish still lingered faintly in the air, a final, fading trace of him. I stood in front of a large, framed photograph on the wall, a black and white picture of the two of us in our 20s, standing in the shell of our very first reclamation project, a derelict firehouse. We were both covered in dust, grinning like fools, Robert's arms slung protectively around my shoulders. We looked young, strong, and utterly fearless. We were a team. I looked at the pride in his eyes in that photograph, the absolute belief he had in me, in us. I felt a fresh wave of shame, not for myself but for him. Shame that I had allowed his legacy, our legacy, to be treated so cheaply, to be captained by a shallow man and a weak-willed daughter. I had been adrift since Robert died, a passive observer in my own life, allowing them to steer the ship because it was easier than facing the storm alone. That night I didn't cry. The time for tears was over. I made a promise to the man in the painting, a quiet, solemn vow whispered into the stillness of the room. They will not destroy what we built, Robert. I won't let them. The next morning the sun rose on a different woman. The soft, accommodating, grieving widow was gone. In her place was someone I hadn't seen in a long time, someone I had almost forgotten. I showered the hot water a welcome shock, and dressed in a crisp blouse and tailored trousers. I made coffee, the familiar ritual grounding me, and as I drank it, black and strong, I felt a clarity I hadn't felt in years. The fog of grief and inertia had lifted, burned away by the fire of the previous night. Then I sat at my polished mahogany desk, the one Robert had salvaged from a 19th century bank, its surface cool and solid under my hands, and I made a single phone call. The number was memorized, a relic from a lifetime of needing his counsel. Arthur Covington's office, a young, efficient-sounding paralegal answered. "This is Eleanor Vance for Arthur," I said, my voice calm and steady, devoid of the tremor I had feared. "Please tell him it's important." A moment later, his familiar, warm voice was on the line. "Eleanor, is everything all right? It's early." "Arthur," I said, my voice as level as a sheet of ice. "I hope I'm not disturbing you. Something has happened and I need to see the original corporate charter. Specifically, I need to see the key person clause." There was a pregnant pause on the other end of the line, and in that silence I felt a lifetime of friendship and understanding. Arthur knew. He had always known. "I've been waiting for this call for 5 years, Eleanor," he said softly, his voice full of a weary sorrow. "Come right over. The kettle is on." Arthur Covington's office was a time capsule, a sanctuary of dark wood, the smell of old paper and the comforting weight of history. It was the antithesis of the sleek glass and chrome world Greg and Caroline inhabited. It smelled of leather and lemon polish, a place where things were built to last. Arthur, with his kind, crinkled eyes and impeccably tailored tweed jacket, was a man from another era, an era where a person's word was their bond and loyalty was paramount. He was more than our lawyer. He had been Robert's best friend since they were boys. He poured me a cup of tea, his movements slow and deliberate, and listened without interruption as I recounted the events of the dinner. I didn't tell the story with emotion, not with tears or a trembling voice. I told it with the detached precision of a witness reporting a crime, laying out the facts, the words, the reactions. I recited Greg's insult and Caroline's laugh as if they were lines from a legal brief. When I finished, he simply nodded, his expression grim, his jaw tight. He didn't offer platitudes or empty comforts. He stood up, walked to a large old-fashioned Mosler safe tucked behind a framed map of the city from 1920, and turned the heavy dial with a practiced ease. The safe opened with a satisfying deep thud, a sound of security and permanence. From within he retrieved a thick leather-bound binder with the words, "Vance Reclamation Corporate Charter," embossed in faded gold leaf on the spine. He handled it with a reverence that made my heart ache. "Robert was a craftsman," Arthur said gently, placing the binder on the desk between us. "He could tell you the history of a piece of wood just by its grain. But he was no fool. He was a craftsman with people too. He knew his daughter. And," he added, looking me straight in the eye, "he knew the kind of men who are attracted to success they didn't earn." He opened the binder to a page marked with a faded yellow tab. "Let's start with the basics," he said, his voice taking on the reassuring tone of a professor leading a master class. He pointed to a dense block of text. "Section 4, subsection B. The key person clause. We wrote this together the week after Caroline was born. Robert insisted on it. He said a family business needed to protect the family from itself sometimes." He read it aloud. It was dense with legalese, but the meaning was clear and unequivocal. As a co-founder and named key person, I, Eleanor Vance, retained final veto power on any financial transaction exceeding a certain threshold, on the hiring or firing of any C-level executive, and on any measure that would alter the company's capital structure or mission. Greg's title of CEO was, in essence, a managerial role I had permitted him to have, a position he held entirely at my discretion. I felt a tremor go through me, the first crack in the AC composure I had maintained for hours. It was a tremor of power, a feeling I hadn't realized I had been missing for years, like a phantom limb suddenly regaining sensation. I had let them make me feel like a passenger when all along I had been the pilot. "But that," Arthur said, a small, shrewd smile touching his lips, is not the real genius of it. That's just the lock on the front door. Robert was a belt and suspenders man. He reached back into the safe and pulled out another, even older-looking file, tied with a faded ribbon. The label simply read, "The Vance Family Trust." Robert was worried Caroline could be easily influenced, he said softly, untying the ribbon with his long, careful fingers. He loved her to pieces, you know that, but he saw her clearly. He knew she sought the path of least resistance, that she was drawn to shiny things. So he built a firewall. A fortress. He spread the documents on the desk. They were brittle with age, the typewritten words slightly faded. He explained that years ago, before Greg was even in the picture, Robert had transferred legal ownership of all the company's physical, non-liquid assets into this trust. The multi-million-dollar inventory of architectural salvage, every beam, every mantel, every yard of antique ironwork, was owned by the trust. The warehouses themselves, sitting on acres of what was now prime industrial real estate, were owned by the trust. The company, Vance Reclamation LC, paid the trust a nominal leasing fee each year, a detail buried so deep in the financials, under a subheader of a subheader, that a cursory glance would never reveal it. The company itself was just an operating entity, a shell. The vast, tangible wealth, the very heart and soul of the business, was untouchable. Arthur let the weight of that sink in before delivering the final, beautiful piece of the puzzle. He tapped a signature line at the bottom of the trust's founding document. The ink was a different color, signed years after the initial creation. It was my signature. I remembered the day now, in Arthur's office not long after Robert's diagnosis. I had signed a mountain of papers, my mind clouded with grief. I had trusted them, trusted Arthur and Robert implicitly. And Eleanor, Arthur said, looking at me over the top of his reading glasses, his eyes shining with the fierce loyalty of a true friend, upon Robert's passing, you became the sole, unremovable trustee of that trust. I stared at the documents, at my own name, at my late husband's prescient signature. A wave of profound, bone-deep love for Robert washed over me. He had protected me. He had protected our life's work, even from beyond the grave. Greg wasn't just driving a car I owned the keys to. He had built his entire paper empire on a mountain of gold that he didn't even know I owned. Armed with the legal equivalent of a nuclear arsenal, I didn't go in with guns blazing. A dramatic confrontation in the office would be messy, emotional. It would give them a chance to paint me as a hysterical, vengeful old woman. No, this would be a quiet war. A war of attrition fought not with raised voices but with the cold, hard language of paperwork they so clearly disdained. Arthur and I mapped out the strategy in his quiet office. It would be a campaign of 1,000 paper cuts, each one small and seemingly insignificant, until the cumulative effect was a mortal wound. My first move was an email. Drafted carefully by Arthur and sent from my personal account, it was a masterpiece of benign grandmotherly concern. Dear Caroline and Greg, it began. I hope you are both well. After our recent dinner, I've been giving more thought to my personal estate planning, and my lawyer, Arthur Covington, has advised me that for things to be in proper order, he requires complete financial records for the company for the past 5 years. He's quite a stickler for the details. I know how busy you both are, but I would be so grateful if you could have your accounting department forward everything to me. My apologies for the inconvenience. Love, Mom. I could almost hear their condescending laughter across the city. Caroline's reply came within the hour, dripping with patronizing sweetness. Of course, Mom. Happy to help. Anything you need, just let us know. So glad you're taking up an interest. It will be good for you to have a little project. The pat on the head was now digital. Greg didn't even bother to reply himself. They saw it as the busy work of a bored old woman, a harmless hobby to keep the walking expense occupied. And so, the documents started arriving. First as a trickle of PDFs, then as a flood of file-sharing links. My dining room table, the site of so many happy family meals, became a war room. I was buried in financial reports, balance sheets, credit line statements, expansion proposals and asset logs. I worked methodically, day and night, fueled by black coffee and a cold, burning anger. Highlighters in 4 different colors, neat stacks of sticky notes, a fresh legal pad for my observations. I was in my element. This was the work I had always done, the work they had taken for granted, the work they thought was unimportant. I found their fingerprints everywhere. padded expense reports, 4 client dinners, at restaurants I knew were Caroline's favorites, enormous fees paid to a branding consultant who was a college friend of Greg's, and the plans for a new line of cheap, mass-produced vintage-inspired hardware that would have made Robert weep. In their arrogance they gave me everything. And in their carelessness they gave me the smoking gun. It was nearly 2 in the morning on the 4th day. I was bleary-eyed cross-referencing a proposal for the massive new line of credit Greg wanted, the one he needed for his hostile takeover, with the asset valuation report their accounting firm had prepared. The numbers felt inflated. Based on my intimate near-photographic knowledge of our inventory, I knew they were overstating the value. On a hunch, a tired, desperate whim, I sent a polite follow-up email to the junior accountant who had prepared the package. "Thank you so much for this, Michael," I wrote. "You've been so helpful. For my records, could you possibly forward me the internal email chain associated with this valuation? I'm just trying to understand the process for my own files." The young man, likely eager to please the founder's widow and assuming it was a routine request, responded in minutes, forwarding the entire unredacted chain without a second thought. And there was, halfway down the page, a question from the accountant to Greg. "Mr. Shaw, do you have the original property deeds for the warehouse properties? The bank may require them for collateral verification, especially for a line of this size." Greg's reply, sent from his iPhone at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday, was short, dismissive, and utterly damning. "Don't waste time on that ancient history. The properties have been with the company for decades. Just use the tax assessments. We need to move fast. Focus on the goal." I stared at the screen, and for the first time in days, a slow, cold smile touched my lips. The sheer hubris of it was breathtaking. It was the linchpin of my entire case. He hadn't just passively overlooked the truth in a sea of details. He had been alerted to its potential importance and had actively, contemptuously, swatted it away like an annoying fly. He was so sure he owned the kingdom he never bothered to check if his name was on the crown. He had just handed me the keys, the deed, and the signed confession all at once. The day of the board meeting was gray and overcast, the weather a perfect match for my mood. I dressed with care, not in the soft, muted colors I usually favored, but in a sharply tailored charcoal gray suit Robert had bought for me years ago. It felt like armor. Arthur, looking distinguished and solemn in a dark navy suit, picked me up. We didn't speak much on the way to the downtown high-rise where Greg had rented a flashy new headquarters. We had already said everything that needed to be said. Our silence was one of shared resolve. The boardroom was a sterile, modern space, all glass and chrome, with a long, polished table that reflected the grim sky outside. It was a room designed for power plays, a room that had none of the warmth or history of the company it was supposed to represent. The investors and bankers were already assembled, a murmuring sea of expensive suits. Greg stood at the head of the table, confident and commanding, a king in his court. Caroline was beside him, her hand resting on his arm, looking at him with an expression of pure, unadulterated adoration that turned my stomach. I took a seat quietly on the side next to Arthur. We were positioned like spectators, observers on the periphery of the main event, which was exactly how they saw us. Greg launched into his presentation. He was a masterful salesman, I had to give him that. He spoke of growth and opportunity, of market share and shareholder value. He used slick graphics and projected growth charts that soared ever upward. He was selling a dream and the room was buying it. When he spoke of the hostile takeover of a smaller, respected competitor, Peterson Architectural, he framed it as a bold, visionary move that would make them the undisputed leaders in the industry. An aggressive acquisition to consolidate our market position, he called it. I knew Bill Peterson. Robert had admired him. He was a craftsman, not a mogul. Greg concluded with a flourish, his voice resonating with confidence. This is our moment to redefine the market, to become the brand that defines this space for the next generation. So, I call for a board vote to approve the new 7-figure line of credit and to authorize our firm to proceed with the acquisition of a controlling interest in Peterson Architectural. He smiled, looking around the table, ready to receive his accolades. The hands were about to go up. I cleared my throat. It wasn't a loud sound, just a small, dry clearing of my throat, but in the expectant silence, it cut through the room like a gunshot. "Excuse me, Greg," I said. All heads turned. My voice was quiet, but it was steady, carrying the weight of the moment. Before we vote, I believe there's a fundamental misunderstanding of our capital structure. I stood up. I felt every eye on me, but this time it wasn't with pity. It was with confusion, which was about to turn to shock. The proposal before you, I began, my voice clear and calm, is to secure a line of credit leveraged against all company assets. However, the most valuable assets, namely the entire multi-million-dollar salvage inventory, the warehouses at the port, and the very land those warehouses sit on, are not, in fact, company assets. A confused murmur rippled through the room. Greg stared at me, his smile frozen on his face, a look of utter disbelief dawning in his eyes. Caroline's hand tightened on his arm. Those assets, I continued, my gaze locked on his, are the legal property of the Vance Family Trust, established in 1985. They are not the company's to leverage. I paused, letting the words hang in the air, each one a perfectly placed stone. And as the sole, unremovable trustee of that trust, I do not approve. As I spoke the final words, Arthur, in a beautifully choreographed move, stood up and began to calmly walk around the table. He placed a single summary document in front of each person. It was a simple one-page sheet highlighting the key clauses of the trust, the relevant property deeds, and a copy of Greg's damning email. The room exploded into chaos. The lead banker from the lending institution snatched up the paper, his face paling as he read. He leaned over and whispered furiously to his colleague. They both stood up abruptly. "This changes everything," the banker announced to the room, his voice tight with anger. "We were not made aware of this ownership structure. Our offer of credit is, for now, withdrawn pending a full legal review." The investors started talking at once, their voices a cacophony of angry, confused questions directed at Greg. Greg's face had drained of all color. It went from smug crimson to a pasty ashen white in seconds. He finally found his voice whirling on me, sputtering. "What is this? What have you done? You can't do this. This is my company." I looked down the long, polished table directly at him, at the man who had called me an expense, at the daughter who had laughed. My expression was unreadable, a calm, quiet mask. "The walking expense just walked away with the bank," I said, my voice quiet but devastating. "This meeting is over." I turned without another look at any of them and walked out of the boardroom. Arthur, holding the door for me with a faint, grimly satisfied smile, followed close behind. The fallout was immediate and spectacular. We could hear the shouting from the boardroom before the elevator doors had even closed, a symphony of panicked recriminations. Greg and Caroline caught up to us in the marble-floored lobby, their faces contorted with a mixture of rage and panicked disbelief. Greg, his professional charm stripped away completely, was a snarling mess of threats and accusations. "You'll be hearing from my lawyer. This is tortious interference. I'll sue you for everything you have," he yelled, his voice echoing in the cavernous space, causing a security guard to look over with alarm. Caroline was weeping, her mascara running in black rivulets down her cheeks, a mask of tragic beauty melting into pathetic despair. "Mother, how could you?" she cried, her voice thick with self-pity. "How could you do this to us? To your own family?" I stopped and turned to face them one final time. My voice was cold, not with anger, but with the dispassionate finality of a judge delivering a verdict. "You stopped being family the moment you laughed, Caroline," I said, my eyes holding hers until she looked away in shame. I then turned to Greg, who was still muttering legal threats under his breath. "And you, Greg, were never family. You were an employee. And pursuant to Section 4, subsection B of the corporate charter, your employment, along with your wife's, is terminated. Effective immediately." I informed them their corporate credit cards would be deactivated by the end of business. They were to vacate their offices by morning, and the keys to their company cars were to be left on their desks. "Security will escort you to collect your personal effects," I added as an afterthought. They were left standing in the middle of the lobby, utterly stunned, mouths agape, as Arthur and I walked out into the cool, gray afternoon. They were left with nothing but their personal debts, their extravagant lifestyle now an anchor that would drag them under, and a reputation that was shredded beyond repair in the city's tight-knit business community. In the months that followed, I worked tirelessly. I was no longer a ghost in the machine. I was the operator, my hands firmly on every lever. I formally exercised my rights under the key person clause, restructured the board, and officially reassumed the title of president and CEO. I brought back old trusted employees Greg had fired for being not aligned with the new brand vision. Craftsmen and account managers who, like me, had been treated as relics. I remember calling Martin, our old head of woodworking, a man with hands like gnarled oak burls. He cried on the phone. "I thought the company was dead, Mrs. Vance," he said. "Welcome home, Martin," I'd replied. I canceled the flashy, expensive projects, sold off the fleet of luxury cars, and closed the pretentious downtown headquarters, moving our small administrative team back to a simple, clean office at the main warehouse, where it had always been. The company became smaller. It became quieter. And it became more profitable and more respected than it had been in a decade. We did good work, honest work. We saved beautiful things from oblivion. I received a stream of messages from Caroline. First angry texts, then long rambling emails, and finally, a single handwritten letter on heavy cream stationery delivered by courier. It was filled with remorse, apologies, and a desperate plea to reconnect. She wrote about her shame, her fear, her foolishness in being blinded by Greg's ambition. I read it, and for the first time I felt a flicker of the old maternal pain. I placed the letter on my desk next to a photo of her as a gap-toothed 7-year-old. Forgiveness might be possible one day in a distant future, but trust was a structure that, once demolished, could never be truly rebuilt. Some things even I couldn't reclaim. The final scene of my quiet war took place not in a boardroom, but in the vast cathedral-like space of our main warehouse. It was late evening and the day's work was done. The setting sun filtered through the high, dusty clerestory windows, sending long golden shafts of light through the air, illuminating the beautiful reclaimed artifacts that were the soul of our company. I walked alone through the quiet aisles, the scent of old wood, beeswax, and cold iron a comforting reminder of what is real, what is solid, and what lasts. I ran my hand over a massive century-old piece of carved oak, its surface smooth and timeless beneath my fingers. A quiet, powerful peace settled over me. I was alone, but I was not lonely. I had weathered the storm. I had saved my husband's legacy. But more importantly, I had reclaimed my own value, proving to myself and to the world that the foundation of any great house is the one person who knows, down to the last nail, how it was truly built.